Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for making time to share with us this morning. Time is one of those things that doesn't really have a deposit program. You can't get it back. So thanks for sharing yours with us this morning. Start with a secondary apology. My research collaborator from this summer, Lydia Mattern, she's a sophomore at St. Ben's this year, had planned to be here presenting with me, but the life of an undergrad sometimes includes commitments that are not of your own making, and that happens to her this morning. So she's not here, but she sends love and greetings. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about anger and hope, especially as it shows up in rural and small town America contexts. And to get us there, I'd like us to start by talking about what we are going to do and what we're not going to do. And to get us to that point, I'd like to do a little bit of self-divulgence, if that's all right. I'm a rural person. What I mean by that is that all of my life, with the exception of a 5-year exile in Boston, was rural, right? I grew up in Pierce, Minnesota, population about 1,000 when I was growing up. I think you're at 1,200 now, though, right? There we go. So we're growing there. And I currently live in Avon, Minnesota, just down the road here, which is also about 1,000, a little bit more than that now. And so that is to say, when I come to this set of questions that I'm going to sort of lay out for us to chew on today, I don't come as unbiased. This stuff speaks to me really deeply, and I care pretty fervently about the way that it develops. I'm also not trying to play the game of an outside academic from afar to say, this is what you really ought to do, folks who aren't me. Because this is me. This is what I'm interested in and where I'm living. But to get us into what we're going to do, we're going to start talking about hope and what it is, discuss a little bit about why we should be concerned about hope at all. Then we're going to move into anger, what anger is, especially as a social emotion and phenomenon, and why we should care about that at all. And then, of course, the ways in which anger manifesting in rural and small town contexts, specifically social anger, may look and act slightly differently than it does in non-rural contexts. And once we get there, I don't know that we'll get all the way there before the break, but then there will be a break in there somewhere. And we'll be coming back and doing some work together on discernment of what good might look like in a context that may be both angry and hopeful at the same time. And we're going to talk about the role that Christian ritual, specifically Christian liturgy, has in forming, reforming, sometimes malforming phenomenon of anger and hope as it shows up in rural and small town America. So there's the sketch, right? We got about 3 parts, which is almost perfect because there's about 3 segments here: before the break, after the break, and then questions. So let's start with hope. And for those of you who showed up hoping for me to start with rural and small town sociology, you got to wait just a little bit for that. Because when we say the word hope, very often the thing that can bubble up for us is a kind of emotion, right? Something that you experience as a wistfulness or a wishing, right? I hope you like these cookies. I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. I hope those sorts of things, right? You name desires that you don't often have a significant amount of control over or input in. And while that's an okay vernacular for hope, it's not necessarily the longest Christian tradition associated with that word hope. To get to what hope is, in the most authoritative Christian traditions anyway, we got to move outside the realm of the emotional just for a little bit and talk about virtue instead. And virtue is something that we Christians stole, philosophically at least, from Aristotle. So if you could come back to Aristotle with me for a little while. Aristotle's concern with virtue, and hope we're going to call a virtue with Thomas Aquinas in just a little bit. Aristotle's concern with virtue was not in the first place being a good person. Aristotle, you may recall, Aristotle was the tutor to Alexander the Great. And so when Aristotle writes his ethics, most especially the Nicomachean ethics, his concern was for somebody in power to be able to craft the good life for those who are under that person's authority. And so for Aristotle, talking about virtue is not first and foremost, how can you be a nice person or how can you make your life better? It's instead about how to craft what he calls the highest human good, happiness, for yourself and those around you. This is where Aristotle differs from a bunch of philosophers who came before him, most especially the Epicureans, where he says, happiness is actually where we're going, folks. If you play this intellectual game with me just for a moment, why are you sitting here? Presumably you have a bunch of reasons. Maybe you thought that this was going to be a little interesting. Maybe somebody told you that you should show up here. Maybe you heard that the presenter was devilishly handsome. That was a lie. Or whatever it was. But the bet that you made in placing your investment of time here with us is that it will achieve something. And that something for Aristotle ultimately orders itself toward the achieving or not of happiness. Because happiness for him is that one thing that if you've got it, you don't need anything else. If you're happy, Aristotle thinks, everything else in life can go by the wayside, even the essentials of life. If you're happy, you don't even need food and drink and sleep. If you're happy, you've achieved the highest. But the trouble with happiness is that it can be experienced as fleeting. This is where virtue comes in for Aristotle. If you want to craft happiness in a sustainable manner, if you want to make a happy life, practice virtue. Now, this sounds like just a cop-out of moralizing, but for Aristotle, it makes perfect sense. Because for him, unlike pleasure, that was the Epicurean answer, happiness depends upon the experiences of those around you. If you have a good friend or a close relative who is experiencing unhappiness or anguish or suffering, and you walk into the room and say, you know, I'm having a fantastic day, let's go have brunch, you've kind of missed the point, right? Because if there are others around you who are suffering, that affects your happiness as well, yes? And so to achieve happiness, you need to do, and this is the point, what is good for you and what is good for those around you. This is virtue for Aristotle, and it is something that is practiced. Now, in the West, we have good memories, so we forgot about Aristotle for about 1100 years. And we don't bring him back into the Christian tradition, if you like, really until Thomas Aquinas. Plato, Aristotle's teacher, kind of wins the day for the first 1100 or 1200 years. But then the Moors come through North Africa into Spain, and so thank you to our Muslim brothers and sisters for reintroducing us to Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas gets hold of him and says, this is a really good system, not simply because it's ordered toward happiness, but because it gives us, humans, an understanding of what it is to practice being good. Because a virtue is something very close to a habit. It's not an individual act. An individual act may be virtuous or not, but to do virtue is to practice it and get better and better and better at it, or to leave it out of practice and get worse and worse and worse at it. For Aristotle, you can actually name some of the better and worse things. He steals these from his teacher Plato, like all the good students do, right? Those four cardinal virtues, right? Of prudence, doing the right thing, right? Temperance, self-control. Justice, rendering to each person their due. And the last one, of course, courage, fortitude, right? And for Aristotle, if you've practiced these, they include a bunch of other praiseworthy things within them, like patience and trust and a bunch of other stuff, right? And if you do these well, he thinks, you will be ordered more toward happiness. And Thomas Aquinas picks this up and says, that's good, but it's incomplete. Because if you live a virtuous life, if you are temperate and you are prudent and you are just and you have fortitude, there's something more that happens. And the thing that happens is due not simply to our work, but to the action of God. And so those four cardinal virtues become infused by the presence and action of God, God's grace, into three more, what Aquinas calls theological virtues. And so if you're good at these things, if you're practicing these four, God infuses you with the next one, faith. And it may be curious to think of faith as a virtue. But again, recall what we're talking about with regard to virtue. It's something practiced, something you get better at. Yeah. It's not something that you can just think about and then be good at. I like telling this story that I've pirated from a book called Art and Fear. It's a little bit changed for my own purposes, but come with me on this. There was a ceramics professor one semester who decided to do an experiment with her class. And what she did was split the class in two. And to one side of the class, she said, you will be graded on only the best piece of pottery that you submit. Just the single best one that you've got. That's the point. Get going. And to the other side of the class, she said, you will not be graded on quality at all. It does not matter the quality of pieces that you produce, only the quantity, number of things. So get cracking, right? And you can imagine what happened. The one side of the class who was graded on quality immediately sat down and began doing research on the traditions of pottery and the kinds of firing that can be done and the different glazes that can be used, and wanted to get a schematic for what the best possible piece of pottery could look like. And the other group, of course, not being graded on quality at all, didn't do any of that. Instead, they sat down and they began throwing pot, pot, vase, pot, mess, pot, pot, that sort of thing, right? Now you all see where I'm going with this already. At the end of the semester, the folks who were only graded on quantity, not quality at all, just number of pieces, they didn't just have the most pieces, they also had the best ones. Because ceramics, like much, not just in the field of art, but also in ethics, is not something that you can know about and then be able to do. This is also Aristotle's and Aquinas' approach to virtue. It's not something you can know about and then just do. It's something you practice. And so faith, the first theological virtue, growing out of those cardinal virtues, is something you practice. It is given to you. God's action makes it go, but it's something also that you do. And the one that we're going to center on today grows out of faith. The experience of faith leads to a recognition that the world is not the way that it should be. And it's not even likely we're going to get it the way that it should be. But we hope. And the hope that we experience in a Christian tradition is not hope that we get to define and then make ourselves, but like faith instead, for Thomas Aquinas, is infused, given by God, which means that both it is a gift and also, again, something that that you practice. Now there's the third theological virtue that we're going to sort of leave by the wayside for a little while, but I should mention it because it's the point of the whole system for Thomas Aquinas, right? All of those cardinal virtues that build into faith, which build into hope, lead to, thank you, 1 Corinthians, what is it? Love, right? Absolutely, it's love, right? That's where we're going, caritas, right? That's the whole point. All of the other virtues coalesce together in order to serve that purpose, which means if you're hoping without love, you're doing hope wrong. If you have faith without love, you're doing faith wrong. If you are doing prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude without love, you're doing them wrong, right? So that's where all of this comes from. Now, if we've set out the idea that hope is a virtue, we have to talk about the ways in which it can go wrong. Hope has, just like every other virtue, opposing vices, because it's not just a practice of virtue. It's also something that can go wrong. Think of it, if you like, as a kind of gauge with a needle in the center. And the goal is to keep the needle pointed straight up. That's where virtue is. But it always likes to tilt to the side, either to excess on one side, too much of something, or deficiency on the other side, too little of something. And for Aristotle, and Aquinas picks this up, virtue is in that center, in the mean between two extremes. So to take a non-hope example, talk about fortitude for a moment, courage, right? We all know what too little courage is called, yeah? That's cowardice. That's a vice. It hurts you and it hurts those around you. Bring the needle up a little bit, become more courageous. However, we also know what too much courage looks like. That is foolhardiness, right? You're not brave, you're just stupid, yeah? That also hurts you and those around you. Back it off a little bit, right? Because courage is found as a virtue in the center, in the mean between those two extremes. The theological virtues function much the same way, and hope's opposing vices. I'm taking this from a number of Jesuits that I can point you to later. So there you go. Once again, students copy their teachers. Presumption and despair are the two opposing vices of hope. We'll talk about despair quickly, but most of the energy that we're going to spend this morning is going to be spent on presumption. Despair is that absence of hope, right? If hope is, as Thomas Aquinas defines it, a desire for a good that is future and yet difficult and possible to obtain. Let me say that again because I messed it up and it's important. For Thomas Aquinas, hope is a desire for a future good that is difficult but possible to obtain. If you cannot see the possibility of obtaining that good, if the possibility does not exist, we are a little bit deficient in hope. We are moving toward the vice of despair. But you can have too much hope, right? And this is where, especially in an American context, we get maybe a little bit uncomfortable, because if there's a good thing, we want the mostest of it, right? And for Aristotle and for Aquinas, that's not how it functions. If you've got too much hope, if your hope becomes so large and bloated that it does not admit of the difficulty of achieving that future good, it becomes something other than hope. Some people want to say, well, no, Ben, that's just faith. Dear friends, no, it's not. Because it actually militates against hope. Faith builds into hope. That's presumption, right? And presumption looks like a couple of different things. One, it can look like a kind of abdicating the role of action in making hope real, right? Listen, God's going to take care of it all. I don't have to worry about it. God will provide, and I don't really have to do anything. That's not particularly helpful in achieving the future that is difficult yet possible to obtain, right? You got to work. But presumption also looks like the idea that only my definition of the good is worth hoping for. Yeah. And if it's only my definition of the good that's worth hoping for, even if that really is a good, I may place it over and above other legitimate goods. And if I do that, I may even substitute the good that I believe in for the good that was supposed to have been infused, the good of God's grace. And it becomes idolatry. Presumption, either as the bloated hope that means I don't have to do anything, or the bloated hope that means only what I believe is what we must hope for and work for. Likewise, in both cases, does not serve hope. And this is the baseline problem for Aquinas, right? If it doesn't serve hope, it also cannot serve love. So at the end of the day, hope's vices do not just take away our rose-colored glasses. Hope's vices militate against the experience and action of love in our personal, professional, and community lives, also our ecclesial lives, yes? So we're going to take just a little bit now to digest what I've set before you, right? None of this stuff is my idea. I'm taking it from the tradition. So if you don't like it, don't blame me. I didn't write it. Aquinas was in the 13th century. But I'd like us to try it on a little bit. What do you think? Does this speak to your experience of hope? Or is your experience of hope different? Notice that I'm not necessarily asking for you to agree or disagree with Aquinas. You can do either one, doesn't much matter to me. What I'm asking for is your actual experience of going through the process of hoping. I saw a lot of heads nodding in the idea that virtue is practiced, hope is practiced. What does that actually look like? What are some of your experiences? And then when we come back in about 5 minutes or a little bit more, I'd like us to talk a little bit about that before we then move to our second piece, social anger. Yeah. But I would love us to share some of that delightful conversation with each other, if that's okay. We have Grace, who's generously offered to bring the mic around a little bit, but I'd love to have at least one or two thoughts, maybe more, from folks who were having good conversation. What do you think about this view of hope as a virtue? What were some of the ideas, the insights, or the questions that are swirling around your tables? Yeah, let's go right over here. Is that okay? Thank you.
Here, can I have this here?
Thanks for being willing to speak in the mic. It helps
Sure.
folks online be able to participate too.
It came to me that the presumption, the
Yeah.
bloated hope, is really the same thing as entitlement that we have as citizens. We're entitled to everybody having the same values. You know, it just, yeah, that's what I thought. The same rights, the same values. And I think that is a presumption.
I love that insight. Thank you for bringing that, right? One of the reasons I love that, and I'd love to go here next, is that it allows us to see, like hope, entitlement is something that we can build socially or tear down socially, right? Entitlement tends to flourish under certain conditions, and it tends to dry up under other conditions. Now, I don't want to give away the game. We're going there eventually, but yeah, thank you. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about that despair means you're kind of focused on yourself, your own problems, and then presumption means you're really focused on yourself, but in like an entitlement sense. But that hope is kind of in the middle, and that hope really requires a connectedness with others and action with others, and that is where hope perhaps is found.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. The connection to others is huge. I do want to be careful because as we're going to move forward, connection to others on its own can go in a number of ways, right? I can connect myself to others who either through their fault or through no fault of their own have ordered themselves away from good social movement, right? And so we have to be careful that there's danger there as well. But I appreciate the recognition that this isn't just about us, right? As particular persons, it's about us together total. Thank you. Yeah. Probably about one more. Did anyone online share with us? No. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, this might be fine tuning an old saying. There's a saying, practice makes perfect. And the kids' middle school band teacher, I thought, had something a little bit more truer. His was, practice makes better.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that, right? One of the reasons I love that is because for Aquinas, as for Aristotle, if you practice virtue, there isn't really an end point. Even in Aristotle, happiness isn't something that you're actually able to achieve this side of death. Happiness is something you participate in to a greater or lesser extent. Likewise, for Aquinas, when you practice these virtues, even when you cooperate with the virtues infused by God, you don't simply achieve them. Now I am loving, I don't have any way to get better at that. Aren't I a wonderful person, right? No. Instead, you participate in the activity of loving, and you may get better or worse. The Benedictines in here are like, yes, I know, but yeah, this practice leaves open that possibility for progress. Thank you. Yeah. All right, so we've got hope, right? This is the kind of hope we're talking about. We're going to move forward a little bit, and I promised you anger, and in order to make you angry, I lied. Instead, we're going to move to this piece about what we can think of as rural and small town social self-understanding, right? The way of understanding much of contemporary rural and small town America that, to me at least, has made the most sense comes from Bob Wood, who teaches out at Princeton currently. He's written a slew of books, the latest of which is called The Left Behind, something like Anger and Despair in Rural America, or whatever it is. That's not actually the perfect title, especially the whatever it is part. But the point that he brings up, pulling from Emil Durkheim and a few others, is Durkheim, not Durheim. I don't have an actual relation there that I know of. Is that the self-understanding of many in rural and small town America is not simply the rugged individualism that tends to get painted. He says in his book, folks might actually be rugged individualists, but that's not the end of the self-reference. Instead, even in those places where rugged individualism is the way that we think of ourselves, is ordered toward whatever local community is most authoritative. Yeah? The moral community. How many folks in here either grew up in, currently live in, or have had a significant life experience in a small town? Oh, just about everybody in the room. Not everybody, but close, right? My strong suspicion is I could ask you the names of the important businesses, places of worship, and schools, and the name of the sports team, and you'd be able to answer all four. Yeah? Because what happens in rural and small town America is not that you stand on your own 2 feet apart from everybody else, but that standing on your own 2 feet only makes sense within the context of other folks with feet. Yeah. And so it makes a difference when a place of worship either thrives or closes. And it makes a difference when a grocery store changes hands or closes or expands. And it makes a difference because we put up billboards when our school teams win the state championship, right? These are significant sources, not simply of pride, though they are that, also of identity. Who you actually are is a person from, and then fill in the blank. Yeah. What Wuthnow argues is that this kind of moral community is built most especially by overlapping networks of accountability and responsibility. And the beautiful thing, he thinks, in much of rural and small town America is that when it's done well, it does not admit of political or social division. Instead, networks of accountability and responsibility in much of rural and small town America are built on proximity and shared history. So if you know a person and you don't agree with them, you still act on behalf of that person because you're responsible for that person in a sense, right? So I live next to some neighbors who do not see eye to eye with my wife and me on pretty much anything, right? But I blow out his snow in the winter because he doesn't have a snowblower. And in the summer, because I'm a terrible, not terrible husband to my wife, but terrible husband to my plants, he will water my plants, yeah, when I forget. Now, these are small things, but what they build is an overlapping set of systems where accountability and responsibility make sense, first of all, and are needed, second of all. Yeah. That's not the only piece, though. I mentioned local pride. Local pride isn't simply, in my experience at least, a feeling of loyalty to a particular area. That might be part of it. But local pride, for Wuthnow and a number of other rural sociologists, is inclusive of not simply that, yes, this is us and we love it. It is also a feeling of home. Well, what is a feeling of home? And that's a cop-out. Well, it means at least two things for them, and I tend to agree. First, a feeling of being with people who know you. And second, a feeling of being with people who share values with you. Yeah. But Ben, you said you don't see eye to eye with your own neighbors, and that doesn't have to do with a moral community. Sure, but there's a healthy difference in some parts of rural and small town America between agreeing politically and socially on the one hand and sharing values on the other. I can already see people in here being like, yeah, but in the last decade, that's gone by the wayside. Sure, but you're getting away from me for a second, yeah? Instead, local peacekeeping becomes really, really important. Listen, you and I disagree, but at least we can agree that this is the good. You and I disagree about what they should be teaching in that school, but it's a good thing that that school is still there. So we vote for the referendum or whatever it is, right? We disagree about fill in the blank, but we at least can share the value that, and then fill in the other blank. When that social fabric is strong, local communities tend to flourish because a home is built. Yeah. The other thing that this brings up is that there's not really an escape. So I just said why this is all nice. Here's why it's dangerous as well. And this is where the social fabric of the moral community becomes vulnerable. If something goes wrong, if division, hatred, difficulty with neighbors becomes deep, you don't actually get to step away in much of rural and small town America. There isn't really an option in many cases to vote with your feet. Yeah. Example from my own hometown. One of the local pastors, none of the priests, none of the Roman Catholics, but one of the local pastors is also the mayor, and he works at the post office. Yeah. So if something goes wrong in that community, you don't actually get away. Yeah. He's everywhere. Now, not just him, right? That's one example for the way that many times rural and small town America self-organize. People are everywhere doing everything because there's nobody else. Yeah. You don't get to say, well, I guess this isn't working between us, and so we'll just sort of ignore each other. Because they're going to be at the council meeting next month, and they're on the school board, and whatever else it is. Yeah. Local peacemaking becomes very, very important. If peace cannot be made locally, that community becomes one of strife, and it can actually die. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This third one, folks tend not to like. By which I mean a number of folks I've had look through this who are not from rural and small town America. Because it sounds paradoxical. Independence, one of the values that Bob Wuthnow reads as fundamental for the experience of much of rural and small town America, tends to be thought of as the ability to stand on one's own feet, make one's own decisions independent of outside factors. Yeah. But for I suspect many of you in this room who raised your hand, the idea that you would be able to make your own decisions independent of consideration of others in the community makes no friggin' sense anyway. As soon as you make a decision, that has concrete and local repercussions. Yeah. And those repercussions are far-reaching, both through space and, here's the fun part, through time. It's sometimes said tongue-in-cheek that no one holds a grudge like a small-town person. Yeah? I don't mean it that way. I mean that the way that decisions end up made carry repercussions from which a rural or small town context may not easily be able to turn. Some of the vast majority of you probably know that rural and small town America carries far more than its share of the poverty in North America, or the poverty in the United States, right? Which means that once a decision is made, you're stuck with it for a long time because you don't have often the capital or the human resources, or sometimes even the expertise to say, we got to do something else. Which means that if you make a decision that went wrong, the curve of moving away from it into something that goes more right is a long curve. And that means that when independence is exercised, it must be within the context both of what it does to those persons around you, and also what it's going to do for the next 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, depending on the decision, right? Independence in the local community or in the farming community or on the family farm, whatever else it is exercised as communal. It is not just you. It is us doing something, right? Now we're going to take just a couple more minutes in small groups. I know we're busting up this a little bit, but if I don't get you bought in on this idea of the moral community, a lot of the rest of the stuff tends to fall apart. So I want to see where we're at here, yeah? And if you're already bought in, great, we can move on. And if you're not, we can talk some more about it. Especially if you've experienced rural and small town America, but even if you haven't, outside looking in, what do you think of this idea? Does this mirror your experience? You can be part of a local moral community, or sometimes your experience is it's a moral community and I ain't part of it. Yeah. Was it take 2 generations to become a local? Is that right? This is an important question because how hope and then how anger manifest depends on the self-understanding of a community. And if our community is a moral community, a network of overlapping systems of accountability and responsibility, where peacemaking is paramount to the local health and in which independence is communally exercised, then we can talk. But if we're not there, we got to talk a little bit more. So does that mirror your existence or not? And I'd love to hear a story or two. Yeah. Either that says, yep, this is about right, or stories that's actually, that's maybe missing the point, and this is why. Yeah. All right, folks, thank you so much for the energy you're pouring into the discussions. I know I was part of a good one, and I appreciate that. I suspect there are many other good ones floating around. I do want to thank Julia, right, from the online community, asking a question about whether and how this understanding of hope may be applicable to folks experiencing mental health issues, especially those folks who may not share a belief in God or religious practice. I'm just going to say 1 or 2 words about that, and then we're going to ask folks in here, what were you talking about? One of the ways that I think that especially Aristotle's view of hope is of virtue is helpful there, is that for Aristotle, the end of life is happiness. And if you can get a person bought in on that, like this is the thing that I want, then you can move into a place where practice can move a person, right? This is different in the context of persons experiencing mental health crises or difficulties or illnesses. Not because practice is suddenly irrelevant, but because practice needs to also be enlivened, emboldened, empowered, sometimes directed by professionals in the field as well. So I guess that's where I would come from, Julia. Thank you. And if you want to drop a follow-up, I'd be happy to grab hold of that. Folks in the room here, what were some of the thoughts that you had about this concept of the moral community or how we're understanding the rural? Thank you.
I just want to narrate a story.
Oh, please.
I'm an outsider looking in on a rural community. I grew up in the Bronx, and needless to say, that is the furthest away you can get. And I spend now, since for the last 12 years, a good amount of time in a small town community. And there occurred once a neighbor on one side of the street that had a Trump sign, a neighbor across the way that had a Biden sign. One night, somebody came and stole the Biden sign. The guy who was the Trump guy came across and said, "What happened to your sign?" I guess he was hoping he changed his mind. But
that's what lawn signs do, right? They change minds.
But the guy said somebody stole it during the night. The guy with the Trump sign went and bought a Biden sign and gave it to his neighbor across the street. Now, this is moral community that I had no idea of from the city.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that story. Yeah. One of the things that I hear you bringing up, and this is important to say, is I don't want to give a monopoly on moral community to rural and small town America, right? Elsewhere in the literature, this is sometimes just called neighborliness, right? And the point that I'll be trying to move toward is not that it doesn't exist anywhere else, but that the experience of neighborliness or the experience of belonging in a moral community in a rural or small town area is disproportionately definitive of one's identity in a way that many non-rural areas it may not be. It's not that it has more, it's that it speaks in a different kind of way. Does that make sense? We'll be getting more specific about that in a little while, but thank you so much. I appreciate the story. Thank you. Let's have at least one other person dive in if you'd be willing, either with a story, question, or insight, something that was swimming around the table maybe. Folks are like, no thanks. Yeah, thank you so much.
My husband pointed out that a ghetto in the Bronx or any place else can be as much a small town as a small town.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, you gave me just the perfect setup to move into the next piece. I'm just going to steal it. Thank you so much, right? Because this gets to the question of why we would talk about hope at all in the first place, right? Yes. It's part of Thomas Aquinas' system and that his name all knees should bend and all of that stuff. But the experience of a localized community, like a community that is not necessarily rural, but is tight-knit, right? Or like the experience of a moral community in rural and small town America. I mentioned that decisions made within the context of a community, or especially on behalf of a community, can have far-reaching consequences because of the limitations of both person power and financial means, sometimes other things as well, right? And I was struck by one of the quotes that Wuthnow uses from one of the persons he interviewed. So I adopted his methodology, and when Lydia and I did our research this summer, we went and talked to people. We didn't distribute surveys to do quantitative data. We sat down with folks in churches and had conversations, right? One of the things that he brings up, the person was talking about, farmer was talking about why despair seems so common. And he said, you know, if, this is a paraphrase, it's not a direct quote, so don't charge me with plagiarism. When folks don't feel like anything they do matters, when there's no hope for something to change, when nothing you do is going to make stuff better, that's when people start to hurt themselves and others. That's when people start to do things that are damaging. Until we can give people hope, nothing's going to change. And that struck me, because if hope is a virtue, a habit, then hurt also can be conceived of as not individual actions of injury, but as habit. And folks who have had experiences with persons who are either abusive or who are simply abrasive know that hurt can become a habit just like anything else. Yeah. To injure the next person over, or simply to run over them without consideration of what is actually happening. For me, that's why hope is an important antidote to what we're going to talk about next, social anger. Not because it gives people kind of an opiate, a release, a place to retreat when life looks poor. Not my point at all. But instead, if we practice hope in the context of a community where our self-identity is bound up with the overlapping systems of accountability and responsibility to my neighbors, then it becomes more difficult for me to ignore my neighbor, to injure my neighbor, because my hope is bound up with their prosperity just like mine. My hope is bound up with their liberation, just like mine. My hope is bound up with our together pilgrimage toward the promised land, if you like. Yeah. For me, that's why hope is important. But what pushes against it? Let's talk a little bit about anger for about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. And then we're going to get to a break time, have a little bit of refreshment, bathroom break, that sort of thing. What I'm saying is, you're almost there. Stay with me for a few. Yeah. What is social anger? Let me start by saying this. It's not the bad guy. Social anger isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? And I should also say it's not unique to rural and small town America. They're no angrier than anyone else is. Look at just about any news outlet, or God bless you, spend 8 seconds on Twitter, and you'll find that anger is endemic in the current American political and social atmosphere. Yeah. Some of that anger is good, because some of that anger is bound up with the experience of injustice and is pushing toward either liberation or justice or simply ethics. Yeah. So I'm not saying anger is always bad. Anger is something that you should quell and get rid of, and hope is going to take it away. No, 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 no. You can be hopeful and angry at the same time. Anger very often is a motivator toward positive change. But as Michael J. Cox argues, he's an ethicist from the West Coast. Social anger is positive when it is conditioned by what he calls prophetic prudence. Now recall prudence, one of the cardinal virtues, right? One definition you can use of prudence is doing the appropriate thing. Yeah. Doing the most efficient thing, the most advantageous thing, taking account of the surroundings and doing what is required, right? Anger without prudence looks a lot more like wrath. Yeah. I am so angry that I'm just going to move forward with whatever it is that I think is needful, and anybody who gets in my way is going to be crushed. That lacks prudence, right? And like all of the other vices we've talked about this morning, it hurts you and it hurts those around you. And so for J. Cox, social anger conditioned by prophetic prudence. I am angry, but these are the circumstances within which I can move towards something better. That's a positive thing. However, absent prophetic prudence, it's not just that hope suffers in particular ways, in two particular ways, right? It looks like despair or it looks like presumption. Because if I'm angry about something and I'm so angry about it that I just don't have the energy to be angry about it anymore, I just throw up my arms and I put one foot in front of the other and I'm not going to do anything about it. This is something that has often been heard in the last 5 or 10 years, especially from aging farmers. Listen, my farm's doing fine enough for me where I'm at right now, but I have no hope that the next generation is going to be able to run it in a profitable manner. Certainly not the generation after that. I know the farm's going away. And so what are you going to do? Yeah. This is despair. It's an anger that has squelched what could be better. Now, I'm not blaming the farmer for that, right? We'll talk about circumstances in a little bit, but that's a problem. Likewise, you can look at it the other way. If I am so angry that this one thing has to get fixed before everything else can even have a possibility of discussion, then that one thing, single issue politics, is going to run over the ability to think about justice, goodness, ethics, values in any of the other contexts of life, which is not good for the health specifically of rural and small town communities, remember, which have overlapping systems of accountability and responsibility. Anytime you have overlapping systems, I'm talking about relationships, right? Which means that you've got a diverse set of persons who have concerns and circumstances that will not be amenable often to the alleviation of one single issue. And if all the energy ends up in that spot, everything else tends to dry up. This is my problem with social anger. Not that it is not good and holy sometimes, it can be. But that if we give ourselves to social anger without prophetic prudence, what we do is become vicious, vicious, rather than virtuous, which leads for Thomas Aquinas to sin. For Aristotle, if you're not a huge Aquinas fan, it simply leads to unhappiness. And in either case, it's not a great idea, right? So let's talk a little bit about despair, and then I'll wind down because presumption is next. Despair, I mentioned, has to do in many rural areas with the exercise of farming. I'm not taking this from me. A number of studies have been done on the experience of industrialization of agriculture and the collateral damage that has come with that. I should be clear about this. For some folks in rural areas, and especially in agrarian enterprise, industrialization has been very good news, right? It has given the ability to produce in ways and in quantities that previous generations could only dream of. And if that's the primary litmus test for whether something is good, useful, and efficient, then industrializing agriculture has been doing really quite well. However, Fitzgerald argues in her book that when large movements forward of industrialization have taken place in agriculture in the United States, she locates this most especially in the 20s and in the 80s. The collateral damage tends to be exactly those social units upon which much of rural and small town self-understanding is built. The family farm, or if not the farm, family enterprise, or enterprise that is located in a particular context. Yes? Now in the 20s, she argues this was the move from horse and, well, just actual physical horses to tractors and trailers and those sorts of things. In the 80s, it looks a little bit different, right? But in both cases, you saw first in the Great Depression, and many of you here remember the 80s, right? Not a great time for prosperity with regard to the family farm. These kinds of memories don't die easily in rural and small town America because the moral community is built not simply by current relationship, but also by communal memory. It is built by the stories of persevering through hard times. It is built by the stories of persons who made good decisions and brought thriving. And it is built by stories of tragedy and loss, right? And the movements within agriculture have been multifaceted. Some very, very good, and some have perpetrated significant damage, not simply to enterprise, but to moral communities. Second, it's not just the movement into the contemporary world that carries risk for rural and small town areas in the United States. Withnaw argues, and I agree with him, that disaster, both man-made, Loka Ashland argues about investments of governments that have carried collateral damage. In her case, it was nuclear power in a particular area in Georgia, but also natural disasters. Recall earlier, one of the reasons that decisions can be far-reaching in rural and small town areas is because of a significant lack sometimes of financial or person power resources, which means that if disaster strikes, aid is very much needed, and aid can be frustratingly slow in showing up, if it ever comes at all. I can give you a number of stories, I'm not going to right now, of experiences of rural and small towns who have simply stopped, died, because of a particular shift, either socially, politically, or naturally, that did not allow for the continuation of flourishing in that area. This breeds not simply real risk, but also a narrative of precariousness. Because we all know we're one disaster away from losing our community, which isn't the same as one disaster away from losing the health of a non-rural area. If you're one disaster away from losing the community, the moral community, you're one disaster away from losing home, you're one disaster away from losing who you are. Yeah? That moves in a different kind of language in a rural and small town area than it does in the non-rural. I use this term, the brain drain problem, not because I like it, I don't, I think it's derogatory, but because it's in the literature. I think it was in 2009, Carr and Kefalos write Hollowing Out the Middle, which is a book in which they describe what they call sort of the flight of talent from rural and small town areas. And they locate it, and they and others, locate it for a couple of reasons. One being a massively widespread perception that monetary prosperity and social clout live in non-rural areas. So if you want opportunity, the story goes that nobody tells and everyone believes, they argue, is that if you want prosperity, you move away from the rural and the small town, and you move to the place where the people are. And this has a dual result for these two authors. One, some real talent does actually leave. But two, it writes a story on the social bodies of those who remain and sometimes choose to remain in rural and small town areas, of being on the periphery and being relegated there by those who would rather not listen to what's going on. The experience of being outside, the experience of being not listened to, the experience of being undervalued, the experience of being simply superfluous and expendable. This runs deep in almost everyone that I've talked to from rural and small town America. Not because it's true, but because it's a powerful narrative. I should point out that Carr and Kefalos have been taken to task by a number of folks, most especially Ben Winchester out of the U of M extension, right? Who argues that what is actually happening is the inverse, right? There is significant opportunity for prosperity, not just in agrarian enterprise, but in a number of other things that rural and small town America can and do provide, that is actually attracting talent to rural and small town America. He calls this the brain game. The trouble is, I haven't read that in most of the conversations that I have had, which means even if it's true, it lacks the power of story yet. Yeah? That's where we're going to go after our break, right? Into that power of story and the ways that we are able to speak to each other, not just intellectually, but form each other ritually, liturgically, narratively. Yes? So that's where we're going, folks. Thank you so much. Let's dive in. It occurs to me that we've been entirely too genial and comfortable so far, so let's see if we can fix that. We've talked, or we ended by speaking about despair, but as I mentioned, that I don't actually think despair is where the main problem is in much of rural and small town America. It's there, but I don't think that's what's happening in conversation with much of rural and small town anger. I think presumption is more dangerous. I think it's something that's happening more commonly. And one of the reasons that I think it's so dangerous is because if the primary self-understanding of rural and small town America is as the local moral community, one of the ways that that fabric functions is by holding itself together. But we live in an age where you can import very quickly and easily whatever you want in terms of ideas, in terms of identities, in terms of community belonging, those sorts of things. And remember what I talked about earlier with regard to belonging. Very often, the experience of being in a moral community is feeling at home because you share values with those around you, even if you disagree about how to put those values into practice. Yeah. But it's more comfortable if you can find a community that does actually agree with you about how to put those values into practice, right? And the way this looks in rural and small town contexts, as opposed to the non-rural ones, for me at least, is that it will speak very deeply, very quickly, in ways that it may not in non-rural contexts. So if I become a part of a social movement or a political movement or some other movement online or from a place that isn't specifically here, I can be made to feel at home in a way that will be far more efficient, I would call it even virulent, than folks who may not share a moral community as a small town. Because now who I am is built by this tribe that I have adopted, rather than the location where I am. Yeah? That leads to this next piece. If I have decided that I belong, and the I is built by this moral community, if I belong to a social movement or a political movement that is not necessarily local, then what I can do is decide that everyone in my local moral community may be wrong. Oh, and this is more fun if a bunch of folks in my local community belong to the same movement. Now all we've got is an us and them, which tears the local fabric. Yeah. This gets particularly problematic because a number of studies have shown that anger, unlike other emotions, is uniquely powerful as a political motivator. Anger is uniquely powerful as a political motivator, meaning that there is a vested interest from political parties, not naming particular ones, that's not my game this morning. There is a vested interest from political parties to keep angry people angry and to make happy people angry, right? Because if I can sustain anger, they'll show up and vote. And if I can make the right people angry, they'll show up and vote for me. Now, dear friends, this is one of the things that sets rural and small town social anger apart from non-rural social anger. One, it's self-understanding as the moral community, but two, it overwhelmingly leans to the political right. In the last two presidential elections, 90% or more of the rural counties in the United States voted Republican. Got real quiet in here all of a sudden. Now, for those of you waiting for me now to drop the theological hammer onto one political party or another, it's not coming. That's not my game. It's not what I'm doing. But we should be clear that if anger is a uniquely powerful political motivator, and we have an overwhelming lean in one political direction as a voting bloc. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that 90% of the persons in rural and small town America are Republicans. That is silly. But it does mean that the voting power of rural and small town America is overwhelmingly red. Then what we have is a political party that has a vested interest in these particular persons staying angry in these particular ways. Now, the reason that's a theological problem is because a massive amount of those persons participate in Christianity. And what we have been seeing over the last few years is an increasing confluence between the stoking of rural and small town anger and the use of Christian symbols and liturgical practices, by which I mean prayers and music, processions, the whole thing. Now, my training primarily is as a liturgical theologian. At Boston College, that was housed under systematics, which is why I teach in that department here. But I teach mostly liturgical and theological courses, right? That's where I'm at. And this bugs me because recall what hope is. Yes, it's a virtue. But it's not a virtue that you get to build and define yourself. The virtues that you get to build and define yourself, those are just the four cardinal virtues, right? Hope is a theological virtue. meaning it's given from God. Yeah? Cooperated with, certainly, absolutely, by your own action, but defined by, given ground in the experience of the divine. Recall I said that social anger is not necessarily a bad thing. Great, let the political parties make people angry. It's not like they're going to stop, and I have no interest in trying to make them stop. But if our anger allows us or forces us to make a certain kind of hope, the only kind of hope that is appropriate for the Christian, we have conflated social political action with Christian faith, out of which hope is built. Yes? That is a problem. For those of you who are like, hang on, Ben, quit beating up on the political right. Dear friends, I could do the same problem in overwhelmingly blue contexts, right? It's not like the Republican Party is the only one to have used Christian ritual in its history. But as I said at the beginning, my interest is in the rural and the small town because that's who I am. Yeah? And so I've got to talk about the political right. Now, I'm not going to tell you the way that I lean because I don't think that's particularly relevant. This is why it's not relevant. Because my hope does not inhere in who gets elected. I don't have recourse to that. My hope inheres instead in the good that I receive from the only one who can be its author, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Yeah? That's where hope inheres. And it is that hope that then leads to the Christian practice of caritas, of love, which means I don't actually have recourse to say, you folks who vote differently than I may, by virtue of that fact, do not participate in true and authentic Christianity. And dear friends, that's in the water. One of the pastors that I didn't talk to, but another person had spoken with, rural congregation in Wisconsin, yeah? Found it very difficult to deal with this rural congregation in Wisconsin, especially after the rise of Donald Trump. I'm not going to beat up on Donald Trump. It just happens to be a historical marker right now, yeah? He got very irritated with his congregation because he was losing members because he was insufficiently hostile to Democratic members of the congregation. What that meant was, in his preaching and praying, he wouldn't do partisan politics. And he was losing members because of it. Now, it works the other way as well, dear friends. I'm not blaming this on the congregations. There are plenty of pastors who are very happy to preach from one side of the aisle or the other. Maybe don't do that. But in both cases, what we have is not simply an unfortunate mix of politics and faith. We have a vice. It is bloated hope. It is presumption. And the reason that this is damaging in a particular way in rural and small town contexts is because of the first thing that's up there. It's very easy to propagate this. Yeah? This is why I call presumption an invasive species, something that flourishes very, very easily, but will choke out the native hope that should be growing there instead. Instead, what we've got are weeds. Now, here's where we have to be careful. How do you clear out an invasive species? That's the correct answer. I don't know, right? We have a bunch of methods, and some of them work and some of them don't. Some of them make things worse. Some of them make things better. But what we shouldn't do is eat the seed corn. Yeah? Instead, we do actually need to work with the native species of hope in order to build structures under which it can flourish. And at this point, you would be correct in asking Ben, okay, that's all very nice. How do we do that? And this is where I have to turn away from politics. So for those of you who are sitting on the eggshells, sweep them off the chair. We're fine now. Because I don't have a social agenda here. I do carry a social agenda with me, but it's not in this project. Yeah? Instead, let's talk about how this can actually work in rural and small town contexts. And the first question tends to be the most difficult. Who actually gets to discern the good? Remember, I said it's presumptive. to decide that the good can only be determined by a particular political party or social activist group. Yeah, that doesn't work for us because in the end, it's idolatrous. Instead, we receive hope from God. Hope is from Aquinas, a future good that is difficult but possible to obtain. For the Christian, to hope for something that is not good is nonsensical. You can't do that, right? Instead, hope must be ordered toward the ultimate good, union with God, conditioned by particular goods that'll get us on the way there. Yeah? It's a good thing for people to have enough to eat. It's a good thing to share in good fellowship. It's a good thing for people to have roofs over their head. It's a good thing for people to be participating in a healthy society. These are all good things that we can hope for, difficult but possible to obtain. They don't come from necessarily who is elected here, there, or wherever. And for those of you who are like, Ben, actually, we need to talk about who's getting elected. Okay, we can play that game later, but come with me for now. Who gets to define the good? The reason that question is important is because of the interplay of these two foundational understandings in Catholic social teaching, which, with much thanks to the Roman Catholic Church, I happen to be Lutheran, outside looking in. Nice job on your social doctrine, I appreciate it. Subsidiarity and solidarity. Subsidiarity tends to be something that speaks really, really well in a rural context. Subsidiarity is essentially the idea that if you've got an issue, trust the people closest to that issue to take care of it. Yeah? Because they understand it with the most depth, they understand what the decisions associated with that thing are going to do in both the short term and the long term. If you have a problem with me, talk to me. And then if I listen because I'm a jerk, then you go over my head, that sort of thing, right? Subsidiarity works really well in the local because that's who you have recourse to, right? Do the decisions in the local. But solidarity doesn't always play nice with subsidiarity. Solidarity is the idea of standing with, right? The idea that the liberation, the prosperity, the thriving of another set of persons is also my liberation and thriving and prosperity. This is also really important in rural and small town America because, again, limited resources of both finances and persons. And so if something has to get done, very often aid from the quote unquote outside is necessary. This is solidarity, right? But the overwhelming experience of persons in small towns and rural areas, at least that I have experienced in conversation and in our research, I'm willing to learn, so you can push against this if you wish, is that when powers from the outside offer aid, it either comes with unfortunate strings attached, or it never shows up in the first place. Yeah? Oh, but on the other side, there's a bunch of misplaced solidarity laid down very often in the form of unfunded mandates. You must do this. Great, how are we going to pay for it? I don't know, just make it happen. And so when those things come through, as one person shared, the things that we already know are necessary, the police department, the trash pickup, the other things that we have to pay for, those things suffer because now the dollars, which are very finite for us, have to go to this other thing that somebody from the outside told us about. Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to say this is always bad or always good. Not my point. My point is that in answering that question, who gets to determine the good, it tends to be a tug of war between the persons who understand deeply what this is going to do and the persons who want to see flourishing but are viewing from the outside. Yeah. Third, and finally, in order to do hope well in a rural and small town context, the answer to what the good is must avoid both despair, well, nothing's going to get better anyway, we're just going to ignore it, and also presumption. This is my way and this is the correct way, do this or get out, right? And those can be really, really difficult to navigate. When's the last time you've been to a small town city council meeting? Yeah? We have all kinds of thoughts and we're going to share them. but to do the good together. Messy process, but also necessary. And it looks like all of the messiness of life associated with building virtue. A messy, well, remember the story about the ceramics professor, right? Just do it. You're going to screw up, but do it again. And you're going to screw up, and you're going to do it again. And you're going to screw up, and you're going to do it again. And the arc slowly turns toward the good. So what I'd like us to do for now is to take a couple of minutes, work out some of the tension that I injected with regard to partisan politics and saying that's not what we can do liturgically, theologically, or Christianly, and instead run at this question: who actually gets to determine the good? If that's a difficult question, let me ask it this way. How can you tell if a good decision was made in a rural and small town context? What shows you that? Yeah. And here you have recourse not to the theoretical, but to experiences. Yeah. Lots of people's hands were raised when I asked if you had experience. How can you tell if a decision was good? What determines that? Because in retrospect, that will give us the trustworthy areas to look when we say who gets to determine the good. For those of you who are like, hey, I thought we were going to talk about liturgy. We are, but we can't do that until we land on a solid understanding of the good. Yeah, I'll say more about that in a little bit. 5 minutes, folks, maybe a little bit more. At this cusp where we're at, just before we dive into the liturgical and the ritual, what thoughts have been swimming around for folks? What ideas, insights have you had, or questions did you explore? Hoping, I think at this point, for about 2 folks to share, if you'd be willing, please. And if there was folks online who were sharing in this direction, Teresa, you go ahead and grab me if you like. Thanks. Yeah, if you'd be willing. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can't give you this. Oh, thanks, Grace. Appreciate it.
Well, I think that opposition feeds on opposition. And that really the answer to your question about how do you tell if a good decision was made is if it increases right relationship with God and with others. And so if everybody like doubles down, this is the right way. And if we feed into this oppositional kind of antagonism, we're not increasing right relationship. And so somehow we have to find a way to, yes, counter what we feel is wrong or evil or opposed to good, but to do it while maintaining relationship and while maintaining love. So it's hard.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the way that you cast that in terms of relationship, right? For at least 2 reasons. This group over here mentioned that for folks to listen, very often folks tend to be drawn to the person who is able to keep the cool head, speak rationally, be able to hold multiple positions and then recommend one, that sort of thing, yes? Which is certainly still there in a number of contexts. And I mentioned the other thing that's there in a number of contexts is the desire to cheer on our champion in order to defeat the other one. Yeah. And those 2 both can live in the same person sometimes. But the reason I love that you focus on this piece about relationship is because this is exactly the piece that defines the moral community, right? When relationship sunders, the moral community's fabric is torn. And that's when the communities don't function well. And the stakes there in rural and small town America are extremely high. When the fabric breaks, the community may not survive that break. Yeah. It may slowly die, suffocating under only half of its fabric. And so where I'd like to go with this eventually, and here's where we're going next, yeah, is the cultivation of trust. Yeah. It's an antithesis to the cultivation of competitive spirit, either in social advocacy or in politics. If I have no reason to trust anyone in my moral community, then the moral community ceases to exist as it is. Yeah. Trust very often is the thing that makes it go. And any of you who have experienced being outside of the moral community, an outsider who is either put up with as a visitor or an outsider who is ostracized because of some perceived wrong, you know what it is to lack that trust. Yeah? It can be profoundly isolating. And if you extend that kind of lack of trust, not to particular persons, but to entire communities within the moral community, to entire factions within the moral community, what we have done is torn our social body asunder. I hardly need to make the theological parallels for you, right? This cannot be the way that Christianity does its life and love. Yeah.
I guess, how do we define if a good decision was made? Time, in our culture of instant gratification, was that good? Was that good? Well, let's look at history. Ooh, maybe we didn't make a good decision there, or maybe this was handled right. So I think just time, just history.
Oh, this is perfect. Thank you so much. So deep gratitude here, because this just gives me the perfect transition into the next piece. Yeah. Why ritual? Why liturgy? Dear friends, because ideas can exist outside of time if you really want them to, but you know what can't? The eating and the drinking and the water bath and the anointing and all of that stuff, that doesn't get to exist outside this exercise of time. And so when we go to Mass daily, weekly, monthly, whatever you're doing, right? You are spending time moving through a series of decisions and relationships, we hope at least, ultimately culminating in union with the God who gives you life. But is it good, right? Is it good? Now, I've been to a lot of bad liturgy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the interplay between what we think and what liturgy allows us to be. Because ritual speaks in a language that's deeper than our words. Ritual speaks in a language that cuts to the core in many ways that intellectual argument cannot. I'm not actually making a theological point here. I'm pulling this from the sociologists that I've mentioned earlier who have made this point. It is curious to them that in rural and small town America, like other places for this first part, argument doesn't change minds. Now, that's not unique to rural and small town America. This part is, however. You would expect that if the anger experienced by rural and small town America was in relationship to economic policy, or if it was in relation to foreign policy, or if it was in relation to particular domestic policies, then policy change should also change the anger. And we haven't seen that. We've seen an impressive endurance of social anger, not just in rural areas, in non-rural ones as well, but an impressive endurance of social anger, even in the face of policy changes and argumentation. So what's going on? And at least for my money, one of the things that's going on, and this pulls from the sociologists as well, is that the language that speaks change is not that of argument or policy change. It is of ritual. Ritual does things to our individual and social bodies, of which we may not be intellectually aware. It builds us in much the same way that habit, virtue, and vice may build us. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about something from Pope Francis. I still get to talk about Pope Francis even though I'm Lutheran. You don't get to keep him. He has spoken about a loss or at least a decline in literacy of symbols, being able to read what symbol does. Yeah. Which is significantly problematic, especially in the Roman Catholic world associated with the sacramental imagination, and no less so in a number of areas of the Protestant world, my own included, right? To be able to read what symbols do gives a person access to what liturgy does in a way that symbolic illiteracy does not. Now, I'm not coming at the real presence here, dear friends. Yes, Jesus' body and blood right there on the table is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking instead about what we're actually doing. What does it mean when you genuflect? And if you have an answer to that question, welcome to symbolic literacy. What does it mean when you make the sign of the cross? And if you have an answer to that, even if it's a quick one, you've got some symbolic literacy. What does it mean when we process together to the front? And even if you have the ability to say, I'm not really sure, but I think it might mean this, there is a kind of literacy that is operative there. And especially if you're struggling for words for it, that's where we need it, because it speaks in a language that is deeper than what we describe. Doing stuff is more powerful than saying stuff. Yeah. This is the reason that I love what liturgy does. A symbol doesn't simply stand in for something else. I'm taking this from French Catholic theologian Lydia Mattern. A symbol doesn't stand for something else. A symbol mediates the presence of an entity to you as a gift. A symbol mediates the presence of something to you as a gift. For example, take something that's not the bread and wine for a moment. Any of you still carry actual hard copy photographs in your wallet of a loved one? Yeah. If you do, imagine that you lose that, it gets torn, it gets scratched. Something more than the photo is lost there then, right? Because that token mediates a presence to you, brings it to you in a way that is deeper than simply, oh yeah, there's a picture of my spouse, right? Our bodies do this all of the time. I had the pleasure of shaking hands with a number of you before I started yapping. And one of the things that happens when you shake hands, at least in our cultural context, is build a kind of first step in relationship, right? Hey, how's it going? With a smile, at least sets you on course to be not a jerk. Yeah? Now, the fact of the matter is I'm still a little bit of a jerk, but you didn't know that when you shook my hand. What the body does builds a symbolic reality that is no less real than the physical reality. I have a good Jesuit friend who is fond of saying there's nothing more real than a symbol. But the way that it works is that it's part of an entire system of symbols. The sign of the cross doesn't mean anything unless it's part of the tradition that gave it birth. The proclamation of the gospel may ring hollow if it's not part of the liturgical tradition that gave it birth. And the eating and the drinking at the table, dear friends, is just eating and drinking unless it's part of the fullness of that tradition that gave it birth. Yeah? Which means that when you do it, a liturgical theologian friend of mine, not a Catholic, so you don't get to keep him, is fond of saying that when you eat and drink, there is a welcome there at the table, but there's also a warning. Because if you do this, you will change in ways that you may not be able to define simply intellectually. Because now you're part of something. You're part of a family, an ecclesia, a church, a local community, if you like. You're grafted into something. That way of doing symbol does not allow us the luxury of saying, I will only take this part of it that I like because I'm pro-life and that's part of this, and so this is my political group now. Or I'm a social justice person and I know that they stand for feeding everybody, so that's going to be part of it and I don't want the rest. No, 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 dear friends. You are now part of a family in which values are shared and in which there is a diverse set of ways of moving toward those values. Not as social indoctrination, but as liturgical, symbolic embodiment. I mentioned, pulling from Chauvet, that symbols only make sense within the systems that gave them birth. Cultural clash, collision, and conversation changes the way that symbols function. This is where I start to worry. I think it was in 2018. I read an account of a political rally in South Texas that culminated with a communal singing of Amazing Grace and a liturgical procession to the building of the border wall. Now, regardless of your political opinions associated with the border wall or South Texas or anything else, that changes what a procession and a hymn do. Yeah. And for those of you who want to say that's an appropriate use of those things, okay, I'm not going to argue with you, but I'm going to say be careful. Because now we're getting very, very close to wedding liturgical ritual action to partisan political action. We are dangerously close to presumption rather than hope. Now, I'm not going to say you're in presumption. It's not my job to call you a sinner. That's your priest's job. But I'm kidding. But what I do want to say is that the vast majority of our ethical deliberation doesn't necessarily take place sitting back, having a cup of coffee and saying, what is actually the correct thing to do? It takes place instead in the lived life that you have. What are you actually doing now? And in what are you participating? That procession example is one of dozens I could give you. Yeah. We need to be careful with ritual because the cultures that give it voice, I'm not simply talking about ethnicity or race or language here. I'm talking about the depth of what culture gives voice to. Bears upon the liturgical community in rural and small town areas in ways that very often can be ignored. So what do you do? How do you converse with a culture that may not be your own, or especially a community that may espouse a culture that is not your own? Dear friends, from my perspective at least, you do exactly what the church has been trying to do. You pray, and you sing, and you listen, and you eat, and you wash, and you anoint. Because this gives you access to a language that builds trust in a way that argumentation does not. Example from outside of the liturgical for a moment. When I teach my undergraduates Introduction to Theology, one of the first things that I say to the undergraduates is that you belong here. And then I immediately say, none of you have to believe that, right? Because if I tell you you belong here, that doesn't do a darn thing, with one exception. It starts a conversation that can only be completed in the bodily action of making a person feel that they belong. Yeah? There is a role for words in this. It gives names to things that are already happening in the body. But unless we can speak the language of the body, ritual, liturgy, we do not have access to the depths of what it is to be human that then builds into the moral communities that, dear friends, are fraying at an alarming rate in rural and small town America. What does this look like in rural and small town liturgy? We're doing okay. Everyone okay? More or less? All right, let's keep going then. This is the point at which those of you who have been patiently waiting for how do we actually grow hope. This is my suggestion. First of all, don't come in with another to fix it. Look at what already is happening. The resources are there. This is the problem with symbolic literacy. If you want to come in and change a bunch of stuff and think that's going to fix it, one of the problems is you've already undercut the symbolism of what's going on. Symbols need context and deep context in order to work well. So look at what is already happening and see which practices build hope. Focus on those. Yeah. I've got 4 examples here. Example the first, the offertory rites. When people offer stuff for the church, it doesn't look the same in rural and small town contexts as it does in non-rural ones. One of the main differences, I would argue, is that in rural and small town contexts, not all, but many of them experience precariousness of their congregation or their parish. Yeah? If we can't make this work, the diocese, the synod, or the council is going to close it. Remember earlier on, I said that one of the things that makes rural and small town sociology interesting is because independence, a defining characteristic of rural and small town life, is conceived of as communal. In the offertory rites, particular persons offer, yes, monetary gifts, but also have laid on the altar very often the expertise. Somebody knows how to do plumbing, and so the church has a toilet. Somebody has a roofing company, and so the church was able to replace its roof. Somebody is good at technology, and so we're able to live stream the service. And every time we lose one of those somebodies, we get just a little bit closer to these doors closing and never opening again. Which means that when the offertory rites take place, there is more going on than upkeep. What's going on is the life of the church is being laid on the altar again. A significant number of rural Christians, in response to questions associated with the vitality of their churches, mentioned that their participation in the local church has very little to do, actually, with either the liturgy or biblical belief. It's much more down to earth than that. Well, you know, most of the time we show up to church, we're bringing food for a funeral, or we're fixing something that needed to be fixing, or we're mowing the lawn. There are social events that take place at churches, and this kind of participation as the center of a local community's social life, that tends to be huge, which means that when the local community offers something, it does at least 2 things. First, it offers for the church itself, but dear friends, it goes out as well. It allows the local church to offer itself as part of this moral community. I'm just curious, anybody in here part of a local moral community in which the church had closed? A couple of folks. I bet you could name people on the council when it closed. I bet you could name particular things that happened on the way to its closing. That writes itself on the body of a community in a way that is not easily erased. The offertory rites build hope because they only take place by the goodwill of the community, and they don't simply look to themselves, they offer to the community a vitality that may not otherwise be possible. Second, this one's a little easier, right? Weddings and funerals. Where's hope in weddings and funerals? Well, it's almost obvious, but let's talk about it a little bit because it looks slightly different in rural and small town contexts than in non-rural ones. A wedding between 2 clans, if you like, in rural and small town America may be the social event of the season. Yeah. Gotta love those older families that had 12 and 15 kids and 167 first cousins. Yeah. And so when this clan marries that one, it's not just hope for these 2 people who are at the altar. This is hope for the community. Yeah. Yes, the sacrament of marriage gives a public accountability to the 2 folks who are getting married. Sure. But remember symbolic literacy. Their bodies, it's not representational, their bodies mediate a vitality of the community that is real in a way now, after the marriage, than it was before. Yeah. This is hope. Desire for a future good that is difficult but possible to obtain. Yeah. Funerals much the same way. I said earlier that a moral community is built as much by memory as it is by context. You know the stories, the lore of the local community, stories of triumph, stories of prevailing through difficulties, stories of loss. These stories live in the community when a funeral takes place. Yeah. This person in the casket is survived by persons who are going to tell you stories, sometimes in the liturgy itself, about that person and what that person did and meant. Yeah. That diving into memory is more than tourism. It's the building of hope. Yeah. Baptisms. Yes, we hope for eternal life with Christ. Absolutely, you betcha. And if you want to take classes on that, Christology meets, I think, on Wednesday mornings, right? Michael Rubicky would be happy to have you, I'm sure. Baptismal liturgies, however, in a local community, don't simply look like induction to the universal church. Where were you baptized? If you can name that church, welcome to the moral community, yeah? It makes a difference. Now, here's the fun part. It doesn't make a difference ecclesiologically, right? You're not baptized into Luther or into Catholic. You're baptized into Christ. And so we mutually recognize our baptisms and such, but it means something in a small town community, whether you were baptized at St. Mary's or Atonement. Yeah? Because that building block of the moral community embodies hope for that particular community. How does it embody hope for somebody who wasn't there? It's difficult because now instead of participating in the ritual, you're participating in a memory of a ritual that you weren't there for. And so baptismal liturgies embody hope by being a visible sign and an embodied symbol for the vitality of the community. This next one is my favorite though, the prayers of the people. And the reason it's my favorite is because it can go off the rails real easy. To get there, I want to say this. You'll notice I haven't put preaching up here. With many apologies to those in here who have gone through holy orders, preaching can be easily captured by presumption. Yeah? Not because of your own fault, that's not my point, but because folks are going to expect you to engage in punditry in much the same way that the other talking heads do. In lots of experiences of rural and small town folks, what they end up looking for in preaching tends to be, yes, Bible if you can, especially in the Protestant world, but what I want to hear is stuff that I agree with. Yeah? And if that's where we're at, dear friends, it's really tough to do Christian hope there. Now, I'm not ordained, not my job. Best of luck with it, and you're in my prayers. The point I'm making is that if you have recourse to the words rather than the ritual, people will be looking for words rather than the depth of ritual. The prayers of the people, however, do something different in a rural and small town context. Because when you name names in a rural and small town context, it doesn't just mean, yeah, I wish they would get better. Our hope for that person looks like, I know they need childcare on Wednesday, let's organize it. It looks like they can't get out and mow their lawn, so we're going to put somebody there to do it. It looks like, I didn't know they were in the hospital. Which hospital and where? Yeah? That's what it looks like to pray for someone in a rural and small town context. Hope is active in that sense. It does not prescribe hope, it calls for it, it invites it. Now you can still pray for particular things, right? End to hunger, care for creation, name whatever it is that you like that is good. But be very, very careful, because if you start praying for things that become too close to partisan politics, you will do two things simultaneously. First, you will bring some of your congregation into presumption, and you will alienate the rest of the congregation, pushing them toward despair. In each case, you push them away from the virtue of hope. Yeah. So to do the prayers of the people well is to bring those two dangers back to the center. Yeah. And I do not envy those who craft the prayers of the faithful, because for me at least, that's one of the most important things that can be done at a liturgy. How can I invite persons into the exercise of hope for actual good things without presuming to tell them what is good and without having them despair of ever moving towards said good? Listen deeply, dear friends, to the things for which we pray and the persons for which we pray, because therein lies the hope of the moral community. Last thing I want to say on this, and then we're going to get into questions and such. Doing this is not simply the province of the cleric or the province of this council or the province of simply the laity. It's got to be everybody. Why? Because, dear friends, the primary symbol at work in Christian liturgy is the gathered community. If we gather and we sing together and we process together and we eat and we drink together, we witness the water bath together, these are the things that write on the communal body, the body we share with everybody else in the room, what is real. And if we start cutting folks out of that, yeah, you know, I can't go to this church because I don't feel welcomed. That church is too liberal. That church is too conservative. That church doesn't know what's going on because it's got the city council members on there and they screwed up my backyard. Whatever it is, right? When we start cutting folks ritually out of the community, we short circuit hope. And to bring us right back to the beginning, what's at stake here in short circuiting hope is to short circuit what comes next. Caritas, right? For Aquinas. That is what is infused after hope. And if we short circuit that, we are but a stone's throw from ripping the moral community upon which the vast majority of rural and small town America depend for their vitality. It's not simply a good thing to be a member of a moral community. In a context where financial, personal, professional resources are almost always limited, it's how we survive. It's how we live. It's how we write Christianity into who we are. That's pretty much what I've got to say, dear friends, because if I keep going, I'll never stop. Like I said, I teach liturgy and sacraments, and so this is the stuff that I love. I can tell you why I love it, but we have about 20 minutes before we should wind down here. And I know there was some stuff from folks online, and I'd like to open it up for conversation here. Please do not feel like you just have to ask questions or those sorts of things. I'm very open to reactions because I have a huge mouth and I can respond to just about anything. So what have you been led to, either in terms of insight or questions or thoughts? What am I leaving you with today? What's bubbling to the surface? Yes, thank you, sir.
I have a good feeling that you were speaking to the choir.
That's why it's fun. It's very safe that way.
But the internet came out in 1996. 14 years later, we had the rise of the smartphones. We have seen the young people not attending our churches, not being involved with the liturgy, not understanding the symbolism. We are seeing communities change dramatically in just the last few years. COVID has sent people away from the downtowns. Many people are now working from home in the rural areas, but they're not joining the community. And in the near future, we're going to be having new cell phones that'll be dealing with artificial intelligence, with virtual reality, creating a whole new world, not involving the church. I belong to a Lutheran church, and the Pew Foundation came out with a study on future church growth. We currently have about 3.2 million people. About 2 million of them are active. In another 20 years, they're projecting that we'll have just 76,000 people attending the Lutheran Church.
I read that report, yeah.
And that is symbolistic of, I think, of all the religions. The conservative churches are actually losing population now in the last 4 years faster than the mainline churches, faster than the Catholic churches. How are you going to develop community with symbolism, with meaning, with hope, when the world is going to be changing so quickly?
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate that. So I'd like to bring up two things, if it's all right. The first is a bit of an echo of what you were saying. When Lydia and I did our talking to rural and small town Christians this past summer, overwhelmingly, the thing that they brought up most often was concern about the experience of faith in young folks. And not just like the youth, like through high school. Usually the concern was for the young adults. So those that went off to college and the young professionals, right? Because there was a sense in which you could actually reach folks who are still in grade school. We've got Sunday school, we've got programming that adults can force them to do, you know, those sorts of things, right? But once you have to actually trust them off in adulthood, then confidence went through the floor, right? And for me, at least, this is a place ripe for the understanding of hope. Yeah. Desire for a future good, difficult but possible to obtain. Now, I read the report to which you refer, and other studies outside that the report aren't that much more rosy, right? But one of the things that brings me comfort in understanding the development of community in a way that seems to be dying now is that, like any other group, young folks have a healthy amount of creativity. I tend to get a little bit uncomfortable, and I know you weren't doing this, so I'm not trying to point fingers here. I tend to get a little bit uncomfortable when folks, especially from my own discipline, start naysaying technological advance as if it's fake. But it's not. We can create lies on it, just like we can create lies anywhere else in life. But the experience of what it does to a person is very real. I know folks who experience community mediated through the electronic in a way to which they would never have access in a physical community, at least in part because of one of the other things that you mentioned, an illiteracy associated with the symbols. And the reason that actually brings me comfort is because there's a bunch of stuff that I don't understand in the memosphere that students do, or that young folks do. It gives them access to a system of symbols that I don't have access to. And for me, at least, I don't necessarily read the exodus from brick and mortar churches as a decline in religiosity. I read it as a hunger for a religiosity that can speak in symbols that make sense to younger folks. This is not how do we become cool. Don't make church memes. They come across as cringy. It's a bad idea. Instead, it's ripe for the possibility of deep listening. In my experience with undergraduate students, one of the mainstays is that if I can actually take the time to listen, it makes an impact that nothing that I can ever teach them ever does. Think in your own life about times when you felt really listened to. instead of talked at. You know what I mean? You could probably name persons who gave you that experience, right? And for me, at least, that's one of the liturgical experiences that our current tradition is underdeveloped in delivering. The ability to listen to. That comes for at least two reasons. One, popular and narrative, and the other, slightly less so. One of the reasons is because we don't really have much in the way of liturgical listening practices, right? There's not a whole lot of dialogue that is not scripted in the liturgy. Now, part of the reason I'm even uncomfortable saying that is because if a person really understands what they're doing in the prescribed dialogues, it should feel like listening. So this is partly a catechesis problem, I suppose. But the other is that the public understanding of Christianity is overwhelmingly one that does not listen. I think it was in 2016, Pew did a study like they do, where they asked a number of folks what they thought of Christianity, give us an adjective, right? And overwhelmingly, the first adjective that came to mind for folks was not faithful, understanding, merciful, devout, or pious. It was judgmental. And so if we are to ask what Christianity is, dear friends, we can't simply have recourse to the answer of what it should be or what we would like it to be or what we have experienced it as. What it is, in the conception of many folks to whom we would like to reach out, is judgmental. And if that's where you're starting from, come back to the shaking of the hands. I met you beforehand. If you already knew I was a jerk who wasn't going to listen, how are you going to take that shaking of the hand? Yeah? At best, we have recourse to disingenuousness, which means that the outreach, if it's going to achieve hope, has to get through that cloud of resentment first. And to do that work, we've got to have more than, this is what you ought to believe, this is what's good. By the way, I have some political candidates that you should probably vote for if you're Christian. Oh, dear friends. We got to do something else. Does that make sense? I know that there's at least one part of your question that I didn't get to. You can reiterate it if you want to. But there, I think you're straight on, right? I don't have a fix for that, other than that first word of Benedict's rule. Thank you to those of you who are OSBs, right? Listen. Obsculta. And the fun part about that is it's conditioned by the love of the person to whom you're supposed to be listening. Unless we can embody that, liturgically, ritually, physically, ethically, I think we are, thank you to Paul, of all people most to be pitied. Yeah, thank you. So for folks online, the next comment was about the separation of church and state, and especially secularization. Yes, the process of moving those so far apart that one becomes irrelevant and the other becomes necessary. I'll leave you to guess which one is which. For me, at least, secularization in the United States doesn't keep me up too much at night. Not because it's not an issue, but because I don't know that I can fix it without recourse to what I'm already trying to do. And that is the exercise of love from the ecclesia, right? From the church. In this sense, I hope I don't make too many enemies here. In this sense, I think Nietzsche was deeply right. If God lives, dear friends, show me where. Now he thought, God is dead, God remains dead, and we are God's murderers, by which he meant that if you look at the suffering that is wrought in this world, Christians are very much the ones involved in doing the wringing. We don't have credibility, dear friends. And in an absence of credibility, we don't have trust. And in an absence of trust, we don't have recourse to the infusion of hope from our end. And at this point, God be praised, it's above our pay grade, right? Infusion of hope comes from the divine, not simply from us, but thank you to the Roman Catholic sacramental imagination, God speaks through physical means. This is why I get deeply uncomfortable with particular folks from either who wear the collar or who don't, or some who wear the mitre or who don't, calling folks too quickly back to liturgical celebration if that experience had in the past been traumatic for them. Experiences either of abuse or of ostracization or of being placed outside a community that should otherwise care for them. Liturgy isn't safe. Now, I should be clear, welcome and warning, liturgy isn't necessarily meant to be safe, but it is meant to be a place in which we can experience the God crucified and risen. And if what I experience first is the violence of my fellow humans, rather than the experience of God crucified and risen, it's not that we don't have credibility, it's that credibility is not possible. Now for this, at least for my money, and this is just Ben's opinion, so you don't have to buy what I'm selling here. What takes place prior to hope is atonement. Repentance, metanoia, a turning. And that's got to be credible first. Yeah? Especially in the experience of young folks and young professionals for whom their identity is built by the moral community. If your moral community has hurt you, abused you, ostracized you, that cuts to the quick. You can't just build that up again by saying, come on back, we'll welcome you. No. There's more to it than that. It's built by relationship. Ritual in that sense is more a destination than it is a sustenance. I don't like it that way, but all I'm saying when I say I don't like it that way is that I don't like sin. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
The pastors and the priests getting together. And if you have seen a difference between cities, and I'd like to point out our bishop who has gone to the Somali community and tried to make them welcome in our community. I thank you very much for that. And I think that's what you should be doing, and you're doing it well. Again, thank you.
Amen to this. Thank you, Sue. I hope this doesn't come across as simpering, but I think we in this area have been very blessed with the episcopacy, not just with Bishop Kinney, or excuse me, Bishop Kettler, who is here, but with your predecessor, Bishop Kinney. Both have been, at least in my memory, significant gifts to the community, not least because reaching to parts of the community that Christians may not think of as us initially has been part of what the Office of the Chancery has been doing. From across the Tiber, the office of my own community has been involved in much the same work under John Anderson for a number of years and currently under Dee Peterson. That's not always the case. And we have some learning to do there. Thank you, Sue. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you, Sue. So so Sue asked, don't we get lost? Isn't there a movement away in a certain sense if that kind of institutional support and attention is not there? Is that where you're going with that? Yeah, okay, so now it gets uncomfortable up here a little bit. Yes. If an institution is built in such a way that persons who are vulnerable cannot access the life-giving resources that the community purports to provide, we've shot ourselves in the foot, right? And that is one of the reasons that I'm very glad I am neither ordained nor will ever be a bishop. It's a difficult part of the job, I can only imagine. But it doesn't make it any less necessary. Because as I said, you can craft conditions institutionally for growing or for inhibiting hope, just like you can craft a soil for either giving good or giving poor yields. Yeah. This is one of the reasons I ended with those very grounded ideas. How do we actually craft hope? I think a lot of folks are actually doing it already. The question is, are they all ordered toward that final theological virtue, the exercise of love? That's where I would end up, I guess. Thank you.
I have a question from Reverend Sarah online. When you and Lydia talked with folks at churches, asking questions and listening, what questions prompted deep conversations?
Oh, thank you. So a number of them did, but I think the one that tended to get the most press, just simply because they were the longest answers, was the question, do you view your local community as healthy and hopeful? Who's in charge of making it that way, and do you trust them? And what was fascinating about responses to that question is because, okay, so methodological point here, in talking to rural and small town Christians, we were inadvertently simply talking to the people who showed up, right? So people who are actually involved in their local congregation, which meant that we would go to a congregation or a parish and we would ask the priest or the pastor, who should we talk to? And they would say, Bob, Joyce, and Ethel. And we would go talk to Bob, Joyce, and Ethel, and they would give us stories, which means they're the people who are showing up, right? These aren't the angry people. So overwhelmingly, they would give us answers about their local parish or congregation that were very positive. But often that would stop when we asked about the local community that isn't just the church. Then there was worry, right? Then there was anxiety. Then there was a sense in which all is not right. And it ran the gamut for the reasons, but many of them swirled around this idea that the values that I hold as true, good, and beautiful, those transcendentals, aren't shared. And even if they are shared, they're not built into the way we do things. And even if we try and build them into the way we do things, we still end up pushing people to the side. Again and again and again, people spoke about the importance of outreach, not broadly, but specifically to the community in which the church already is. In a town of 500 in north central Minnesota, folks spoke about a healthy community that they were in the church. The church had 300 or 400 families in a town of 500. But they weren't coming from the town of 500. Yeah? They were coming from elsewhere, 20, 30 minutes away, an hour away, maybe from the north of the cities even. And many of the concerns I heard from persons at that church was, how are we going to reach the people who are already here, like down the street? That, I think, was one of the common threads that gave me the most pause, because the hope that I hear there is for either a return or a revitalization of the moral community that has become not mendicant, but at least traveling, right? Thank you so much. I appreciate that question. By all means, feel free to follow up there in the text if you would like. But back here, yeah. I am here too, right? You see my body. So the question came up, how does atonement function? How can you see where it's actually working out? What does it look like? That's sort of where you're coming from. Great. So I'm going to give you a 20-minute answer in 2 minutes. For my money, one of the best ways of understanding atonement, reconciliation, that sort of thing, comes from ethicist Margaret Farley. Now, she's pirating this particular piece from Jacques Derrida, right? So if you want to look for this, it's in her book, Changing the Questions. Chapter 18 is Forgiveness in the Service of Justice and Love. But what she says is, at least from the human side, forgiveness and atonement, reconciliation, takes place in service of justice. And it does so only if we are able to talk about at least these 5 things. I'm just going to name them and then sort of leave folks to think, are we doing a good job of this or not? Because if you don't have these 5 things, you have forgiveness in the service of injustice. That is to say, forgiveness that's just another name for enabling abuse. 1, acknowledge a wrong when it actually takes place. You've all had the experience of somebody doing something wrong and then saying, well, nothing was wrong. It's very difficult to move forward in that kind of a relationship, right? And atonement fundamentally is the repairing of a relationship. 2, the expression of remorse, right? Maybe you've had this experience before where you did something wrong and you say, well, I know it was wrong, but I would have done it again just the same. No, very difficult to repair the relationship unless remorse is present. And third, there's 2 more beyond this, but the first 3 kind of go together. An actual ask for forgiveness. And that's a tough one because we can often get into a situation where it's easier for us, especially institutionally, to pretend like, well, that was then, and this is now. We don't have to go through the process of asking for forgiveness again and again and again. But unless we do so, those persons who have experienced injustice or wrong or abuse or whatever it is, can't actually move forward to the repairing of a relationship. I say often to my undergraduate students, you can't unpunch someone. We're not talking about fixing a relationship as if it never had been broken. We are talking about moving a relationship through the cauterization and stitching process into the scarring process. That's what atonement is. Even if those first 3 are present, number 4 is where it gets difficult, a change in behavior. And the reason number 4 is difficult is because it requires trust. Sometimes trust is not warranted. And other times trust is impossible. Still other times it's inadvisable. And a few times there is enough shared history of the moral community that trust actually is possible, that the community or the institution or the person will change the behavior that was harming. And even if you get to that point, we're still not to the 5th one, which is an attempt at reparations, an attempt at making things right. Yeah. Now, I just got done saying you can't unpunch somebody, but what you can do is enter into the relationship with that person with whom you had a fight, such that what you did may be undone, not in a perfect way, but in an acceptable way. Not in a way that brings you back to original blessedness. We can't uneat the apple either, dear friends, but rather in a way that moves us toward those areas that we are in faith, hope, and love in pilgrimage to. Yeah. The trouble with that one is that just like hope, I often don't get to define what reparations need to look like. This is a pastoral question. What do reparations need to look like in order to repair this particular relationship? Now, I said I would give you a 20-minute answer in 2 minutes, and I've gone to 5. I apologize. For me, that's where atonement adheres. Unless we can do those 5 things, we haven't even opened the door to atonement in the first place. Thanks, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your energy and your conversation this morning, and I look forward to speaking with you more. Thanks so much.